Hello, classmates. I will be doing my project on Afghanistan refugees. Afghanistan refugees started up during the Soviet-Afghanistan War, which started on December 24th, 1979, and ended on February 15th, 1989. The war derived from a 1978 military coup in which Afghanistan's Communist Party took control over Afghanistan. The Communist Party started initiating radical modernization reforms throughout the country that were forced and deeply unpopular, particularly among the traditional rural population. The regime's nature of suppressing opposition included executing thousands of political prisoners and led to the rise of anti-government armed groups. And by 1979, large parts of the country were in open rebellion. One of the examples of what happened under the communist regime was that the Mujahideen rebels executed the Afghan's communist leader in 1979 before the Soviets took control of the country. So the Soviets took over Afghanistan and instilled one of their own leaders in an attempt to reunite the Communist Party of Afghanistan against these Mujahideen rebels. These rebels fought using guerrilla warfare tactics, and they fought the Soviets mostly in the rural countryside. The Mujahideen rebels were supported by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. Originally, the Soviets were only there to offer light assistance to the communist Afghan soldiers, but as the war went on, the Mujahideen rebels began to use the mountainous terrain to their advantage, and the Afghan communists were losing control of the territory. So the Mujahideen began acquiring more weapons from seizing Soviet barracks and getting weaponry from the United States. The Soviets then began to rely more on heavy air bombing of the countryside in an attempt to get the rebels out into open combat. In in 1987, the United States actually offered the Mujahideen rebels a good tool at fighting the Soviet air power. So they introduced the ground air Stinger missile, which shot down an average of about one airplane per day when it was in use with the Mujahideen rebels. Afghan citizens really got caught up in the harsh realities of war. Villages were bombed to the bare earth, irrigation ditches were destroyed, cutting down the flow of drinking water, and millions of landmines lay scattered across the region. The war ended in 1989 after a peace treaty with the Soviet Union, and it was ultimately seen as the Soviets' Vietnam War because it took 9 years to resolve and ultimately failed to quell the Mujahideen insurgency. At the end of the war, about 2 million civilians were killed, and 6.2 million refugees fled to Pakistan and Iran. The next source of really big refugee movement was during the Afghan Civil War, which took place between 1992 and 1996. It started between five or six Mujahideen armies. Um, in the Afghan government tried to set up this new government called the Islamic Emirati of Afghanistan to replace the Republic of Afghanistan. A civil war was ignited when the Hezbollah, led by Hekamider, with support from Pakistan, refused to join a coalition government with other Mujahideen groups. The Hezbollah vowed to conquer Kabul for themselves, and the other Mujahideen armies had no choice but to confront Hekamider's forces in Kabul and prevent them from taking over the city and the country. 4 months in, about 500,000 Afghan refugees fled the city of Kabul as the city was facing heavy airstrikes, and by 1994, Kabul's population dropped from 2 million to 500,000 people. By 1995 and 1996, The new militia to the Taliban The new militia, the Taliban, supported by Pakistan and ISL, became the strongest player in the Afghan civil war. The Taliban eventually conquered the cities of Kandahar, Herat, Jalabad, and Kabul in September of 1996. Kabul became heavily damaged as a result of airstrikes and rockets. Thousands of civilians were killed, and ceasefires and peace accords had mostly failed and drove nearly 1 million people to flee the violence as refugees. And they mostly fled to neighboring Pakistan and Iran. And in their efforts, they fled to northern cities to get away from the southern areas of Afghanistan under Taliban rule. The last part was the war in Afghanistan, which took place between 2001 to now. Refugees have fled Afghanistan during this time due to deteriorating security and threats from the Taliban and other government forces. Almost 3/4 of returning Afghan refugees who fled home are forced to flee again due to violence. And a report found about 1,200 Afghans were forced to flee each day, even in modern 2017. The Taliban have been steadily gaining more control over Afghan territories recently as the United States has scaled back combat operations in Afghanistan. Civilian casualties are at a record high, and suicide bombings are still common. In Afghanistan, even humanitarian organizations have refused to assess full-blown operations, as several staff members have been killed in attacks over there. And Afghan refugees are still facing many dilemmas, as Pakistan officials have recently suggested that the 3 million Afghan refugees living in Pakistan need to return home. And so far, 600,000 have been sent back to their home country of Afghanistan.